All right, welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive.
Definitely. Always ready to dig into some fascinating stuff.
And we've got some fascinating stuff for you today. We're going to be taking a close look at two U.S. government-funded media organizations.
Hmm.
The U.S. Agency for Global Media, or USAGM,
Yep.
and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, CPB. We're going to be pulling a lot of our information from Project 2025, Section 2, Chapter 8.
Ah, yes. This document, it lays out some pretty big potential reforms. Some might even say radical.
It does get pretty into it, so get ready to uncover some interesting facts about these
And
organizations.
maybe even some things that are a little bit shocking.
Definitely. Okay, let's start with the USAGM. Now, most people probably know them through their outlets like Voice of America,
Right. Voice of America or VOA.
Radio Free Europe.
Radio Free Europe, yep.
These outlets broadcast news and information all over the world.
The mission statement, and they're very clear about this, is to inform, engage, and connect people around the world in support of freedom and democracy.
Sounds pretty good, right?
It's great, right? But our source here is claiming there are some pretty big issues that are, well, they say it's hindering their effectiveness.
Yo!
Yeah, and some of this stuff is pretty alarming. Like starting right off the bat, there are some security vulnerabilities.
Wait, hold on. This is an agency that's promoting American ideals globally,
Right.
and they've got security problems.
Yeah, apparently so. And we're not talking small potatoes here.
So what kind of problems? What are we talking about here?
So both the Office of Personnel Management, that's OPM,
Okay.
and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the ODNI,
Mm-hmm.
they've both raised some serious red flags. They found that for a period of time, almost 40% of USAGM personnel in national security sensitive positions had potentially falsified credentials.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we're talking about background checks not being done properly. I mean, that leaves the agency wide open.
To all sorts of things.
Exactly, all sorts of bad stuff.
Yeah. That's a little unnerving to think about. The source also mentioned something about controversy surrounding the firewall at USAGM
Right, the firewall.
that's supposed to protect their journalistic independence.
Right, so the firewall is there to protect the content that USAGM outlets produce.
Okay.
It's designed to keep the government from interfering. So what you hear on Voice of America, for example, should be free from any political bias.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. But if it's supposed to protect against bias, why is it controversial?
Well, the argument is that the firewall actually makes it harder to hold people accountable for problems.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it shields them from oversight.
I see.
The source even suggests that it might be allowing anti-American bias to grow within the agency.
Oh, wow.
Things got really heated during the Trump administration when the firewall regulation was entirely revoked.
Really?
Yeah, that caused a huge backlash from journalists who saw it as a direct attack on press freedom.
I bet.
So you can see why people have strong feelings about this firewall thing.
Absolutely, yeah. So we've got security risks,
Right.
accusations of bias,
Mm-hmm.
and then on top of all of that, there's the issue of money, right?
Yeah, the money. The source claims that the USAGM could run just fine on $100 million less per year.
100 million.
$100 million. They say there's just too much waste,
Wow.
redundancy, and they even mention nepotism within the agency.
Hold on, nepotism.
Yeah, giving jobs to friends and family rather than qualified people.
I see.
And that's not all. They also point to the USAGM's use of the J-1 visa program.
J1.
That's designed for cultural exchange, right? They're using it to hire foreign journalists for jobs that Americans could be doing.
Oh, so they're saying they're taking advantage of the system.
That's what they're saying, yeah. They say it's a way to avoid paying American wages.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there. So we've got the way the USAGM is being run, the money, but what about the actual content?
Well, funny you should ask, because the source also criticizes this shift from shortwave radio to web-based technologies.
So moving away from traditional broadcasting.
Exactly. Now I get it, staying current, but they argue that relying too much on the internet could be a problem during a conflict, especially when you consider things like internet access.
Yeah, what happens if a country's internet gets disrupted?
Exactly, like we saw in Ukraine after the Russian invasion.
You need to be able to get information to people on the ground.
And that's where shortwave radio comes in. It can be a lifeline.
Absolutely. So with all of this in mind, the source is calling for some pretty big changes.
Oh yeah, big changes. They suggest consolidating services within the USAGM,
Consolidating.
combining things, getting rid of redundancy.
Okay.
And get this, they even suggest putting the agency under the supervision of the National Security Council. or the
Whoa.
State Department.
So basically more direct government control.
Right. Now, that's obviously going to be controversial.
I can imagine.
On the one hand, you need better oversight, accountability, especially with security and spending.
Right.
But then you've got the risk of censorship.
Yeah, the government controlling what gets said.
Exactly. A chilling effect on the journalists.
And this is something I think a lot of our listeners are probably thinking right now.
Mm-hmm.
If there are concerns about bias already at the USAGM,
Yeah.
how can we be sure that bringing in more government control wouldn't actually make it worse?
It's a valid question, for sure. And the source doesn't really offer a solution to this dilemma.
So how do you find that balance?
Right. How do you balance the need for security and accountability with the need to protect journalistic freedom, especially when we're talking about an agency that's supposed to be promoting American values?
That is a tough question.
A tough question with no easy answers.
Yeah, and it's definitely something for all of us to be thinking about as we consider the role of government-funded media.
In a global world.
In a global world, exactly. But before we go too far down that road, let's shift gears a bit
Okay.
and talk about the other big organization in today's deep dive, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Ah, yes, the CPB. Now, this is where things get really interesting,
Oh.
especially when we start thinking about the political side of things.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's dive in. The CPB, you said it gets interesting when we bring in politics.
Well, yeah, I mean, the CPB, that's who mainly funds NPR
Okay,
and PBS.
right. National Public Radio and the Public Broadcasting Service.
All those iconic voices you hear on Morning Edition or those fascinating documentaries on PBS,
Right.
taxpayer dollars are helping to make that happen.
Right, those are household names, NPR and PBS.
Yeah, for sure.
But I do remember hearing something about repeated attempts to defund the CPB.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Every single Republican president since Nixon
Wow.
has tried to cut off funding to the CPB.
That's a long time, so it makes you wonder why,
Yeah.
right? And the source here points to accusations of bias,
Yeah.
specifically a liberal slant in the content they're putting out.
Exactly. They even cite a 2014 Q research study
Okay.
that found a pretty significant gap in the political leanings of the audiences for both NPR and PBS.
Interesting.
60% of PBS viewers identify as liberal, compared to only 15% conservative.
So a pretty big difference there.
Yeah, and for NPR, the numbers are even more striking, 67% liberal versus just 12% conservative.
Wow. Okay, so then it becomes this question of should taxpayers be funding media organizations that are seen as catering to a particular viewpoint?
It's tricky, right?
Mm-hmm.
It really gets at what we expect from public broadcasting. Should it be striving for absolute neutrality,
Mm-hmm.
or is it okay to have a slant as long as the content is valuable?
And the source here seems to lean towards the neutrality side of things.
Oh, yeah, for sure. They argue that if the next president wanted to, they could defund the CPB pretty easily.
How so?
They could just refuse to sign any budget that includes that funding.
I see.
And their point is that NPR and PBS could survive without government funding.
You think so?
Well, they can rely on those membership fees that they already have,
Right.
and then you've got donations from corporations and foundations.
Okay, but wouldn't that then make them even more beholden to those private interests?
That's one argument.
And what about the idea that public broadcasting serves a really important purpose for people who can't afford things like cable or streaming services?
Right. Yeah. There's a lot of factors at play here.
Definitely. So the source also makes this argument that NPR and PBS don't actually deserve their special status as non-commercial educational stations.
Right. The NCE designation.
Yeah. So what exactly does that mean, NCE?
Basically, it means that they're operating for educational purposes
Okay.
and don't need to generate a profit.
I see.
And that comes with some pretty big perks, things like reserved radio frequencies,
Okay.
exemption from certain licensing fees, all sorts of things.
Yeah, I imagine losing that designation would be a big deal for them.
Huge deal, both financially and in terms of their reach.
So then what's the argument for taking that status away?
Well, the source claims that NPR and PBS have just strayed too far from their original educational mission.
In what way?
Well, they point to the fact that they do run ads.
They do.
Yeah, even though they call them underwriting announcements.
Right.
And then their actual educational content has dwindled.
So basically they're saying that NPR and PBS have become more like commercial broadcasters than public service organizations.
That's the argument.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if they were to lose that NCE status,
Mm-hmm.
they would be forced to compete more directly with other broadcasters.
Wow, this is way more complex than I realized.
It is, isn't it?
So we've got potential defunding, challenging the very definition of public broadcasting accusations of bias. I can see why this debate gets so heated.
And it really boils down to this question of government's role, right?
Mm-hmm.
Should taxpayer dollars be going towards organizations that are perceived as leaning to one side politically, even if they provide valuable content?
Or should the government just stay out of the media business entirely?
Let the free market decide what survives.
These are big questions.
Big questions. No easy answers.
It seems like we're always trying to find that balance.
Always.
That tension between the benefits of government support
Right.
and the potential for government interference.
And it's not just the USAGM and CPB either.
Right. Plays out everywhere. So many different areas. It's about where do we draw that line between individual freedom and then our responsibility to each other.
Yeah. When is it okay for the government to step in, and when should they stay out?
Exactly. Big questions that we've been debating forever.
Centuries.
And there's never going to be one right answer, is there?
Probably not, but it is important to have these conversations.
Well, absolutely.
To hear the different sides.
To get those perspectives.
And to really think critically about the information that we're being given.
I agree with you completely. It's easy to just go along with what we hear.
Totally.
But taking that time to really understand these issues is so important.
If we actually want to have a say in the decisions that are being made.
Exactly.
You know, it's funny because this whole conversation, it actually ties back to what the deep dive is all about.
Really?
Yeah, we're bombarded with information all the time.
Oh, tell me about it.
And it's so hard to figure out what's important.
What's real even? Exactly. And that's where that critical thinking comes in.
Absolutely.
It's not just about absorbing the information.
No.
It's about engaging with it, asking those questions.
Looking for evidence.
Exactly.
Becoming better consumers of information.
More discerning.
Yes.
Yeah.
And this is true whether that information is coming from a government-funded outlet.
Or private organizations.
Social media.
Your crazy uncle.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So while this deep dive has been about USAGM and CPB, it's really about a lot more than that.
It is.
It's about giving ourselves the tools that we need to navigate this world.
Which is changing so fast.
Is so fast.
And so much information.
And the future of media, it's all tied to this.
It really is. It all comes down to media literacy in a way, doesn't it?
It does, being able to look at the information you're getting and figure out
what's fiction.
exactly. And then also understanding that bias exists everywhere.
Everywhere, not just in government-funded media.
It's in the algorithms that are deciding what we see on social media.
It's in the news sources that we choose.
It's in us.
It's in all of us, our own personal biases.
100%.
So recognizing that bias is so important.
So important. It's the key to making good decisions, having those conversations.
Right. And so this deep dive, it's given me a lot to think about.
Me too.
And it's clear there are no easy answers here.
No.
But I think having these conversations, questioning things and looking for those different viewpoints.
That's a different perspective.
That's how we become better citizens.
More informed, more discerning.
Exactly. And so I want to leave our listeners with a few questions.
Okay.
What role do you think government should play in funding and overseeing media?
That's a good question.
How can we ensure that government-funded media stays free from bias and political influence?
It's tough, right?
It is tough. And I think the most important question of all is, what can you do personally to be a better consumer of information?
What can you do to get involved?
Yeah,
Keep asking those questions. Keep exploring and keep diving deep.
I love that.
The future of media really depends on it.
It really does. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
Always a pleasure.
And we'll see you next time for another exploration of, well, everything. As we start to wrap up this deep dive into USAGM and CPB, one thing that really sticks with me is the sheer complexity of all of this.
Yeah, it's not a simple issue, is it?
Yeah.
There are so many different sides to consider.
And valid arguments on each side, too.
Exactly. And I think what makes it even harder is that the potential consequences are really hard to predict.
That's true. It feels like we're dealing with a lot of unknowns.
Definitely.
But maybe it's not even about finding the right answer, you know?
That's a good point.
Maybe it's more about making sure we understand all the different perspectives, the history behind all of this, and the potential trade-offs that come with any decision we make.
Thinking about those unintended consequences.
Exactly. And I keep going back to this idea of a lost opportunity.
Oh, yeah, we touched on that earlier.
What if these organizations, the USAGM and CPB, had actually achieved everything they set out to do?
It's an interesting thought, isn't it?
It is. Imagine a world where USAGM consistently put out accurate and unbiased information to the entire world.
Countering propaganda, promoting those democratic
Which is
values.
exactly. And CPB, imagine if they stuck to a completely nonpartisan approach to their content.
Bringing people together instead of driving them apart.
Yeah.
It's a nice thought. But I think as we've seen, the reality is just so much more complicated.
It is. We're dealing with real issues, security concerns,
Slice.
funding challenges,
And this whole evolving media landscape.
which makes me wonder what's next for organizations like these.
What is the future of government-funded media?
Right. Will they be able to adapt?
Can they keep the public's trust?
Those are big questions.
Questions that we're going to be grappling with for a while, I think.
Definitely. And it makes this whole conversation feel very personal, doesn't it?
It does.
Because it's not just some abstract policy debate.
It affects all of us.
Yeah, it's about where we get our news from, how we form our opinions about the world.
The role that media plays in shaping our understanding of, well, everything.
Exactly. And it really highlights how crucial media literacy is.
Being able to look at that information critically.
Yes. Evaluate it, figure out what's fact, what's not.
Spotting those biases.
And that bias is everywhere. It's not just in government-funded media.
It's everywhere. It's in the algorithms that are choosing what we see online.
It's in the news sources that we choose to follow.
It's even in us.
It is, in all of us. We all have those inherent biases.
Being aware of that is so important.
So important for making those informed decisions, for having those real conversations.
It's the foundation for a healthy society, I think.
I agree with you. This deep dive has given me a lot to think about, and I hope it's done the same for our listeners.
Me too. It's been a great discussion.
It has. And I think the big takeaway here is that there are no easy answers.
Nope.
But by having these conversations, by questioning things and looking for different viewpoints,
Engaging with those different perspectives.
we can become better citizens.
More informed, more discerning.
Exactly. And so to wrap things up, I want to leave our listeners with a few questions.
Okay, I like it.
What role do you think government should play in funding and overseeing media?
Good one.
How can we ensure that government-funded media stays free from bias and political influence?
A tough one for sure.
It is tough, but I think the most important question of all is what can you do personally to become a better consumer of information?
How can you make a difference? What can you do to get involved? Keep asking those questions, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.
I love that.
The future of media really does depend on it.
It really does. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the USAGM and the CPB.
Always a pleasure.
And we'll see you next time for another exploration of, well, everything.